History people, today we are going to be introducing the Industrial Revolution, which is going to be our topic for the next couple of weeks. Here are your goals. We'll talk about these 5 questions or commands, as they may be, at the beginning of class tomorrow. Okay, so let's start by talking just about what do we mean when we say Industrial Revolution. So to start with, let's go ahead and say that the Industrial Revolution is the most important event in human history since the Agricultural Revolution. That is, since we learned to farm. In the same way that the Agricultural Revolution transformed human societies from a bunch of hunter-gatherers to a bunch of farmers, the Industrial Revolution transforms human society from a bunch of farmers to, well, a bunch of all sorts of stuff. But it turns us into an urban, global society. And so the basic definition of the Industrial Revolution is a sort of economic takeoff. So think of a plane taking off at this point. It's an economic takeoff fueled by social, economic, and technological changes. And so the Industrial Revolution is characterized by a couple of big changes. One, and perhaps the most obvious, is mechanization. And this means the replacement of human or animal power with machine power. So before the Industrial Revolution, everything was done either by something with muscles, either a human or maybe an animal led by a human. After the Industrial Revolution, we have machines doing most of the hard work. On top of this, there's an exponential increase in productivity. The amount of stuff that is made just starts going up and up and up. And that's because each economic breakthrough leads to further breakthroughs. And we'll talk more about this later. But you can see this in the chart over there to the right. So that line represents the gross world product. That is the value of stuff produced every year. So if you'll look at the year 1800, basically it's almost nothing compared to the amount of stuff produced today. And that is because of the changes resulting from the Industrial Revolution. Urbanization is another big thing that's happening. So partially because of mechanization, people start moving into the cities. This is partially because agriculture becomes more efficient, so fewer farmers can support bigger cities, but also because people are moving to the cities to work in factories that are opening up during this time period. And finally, there's a trend that we're going to call rationalization. This is basically where traditional forms of economic activity are eliminated and replaced by new, more productive and efficient forms. So we're getting rid of the old ways of making stuff and introducing increasingly efficient ways of making stuff. And so the basic timeline here for the Industrial Revolution is that it begins in the late 1700s in Britain and kind of stays in Britain from 1780 to 1820. After 1820, the Industrial Revolution begins to spread, but only to a couple lucky places. Europe, North America, and Japan all industrialize by around 1900, but the rest of the world remains non-industrial. After 1900, though, the rest of the world slowly starts to catch up to these industrialized places, but really not. A lot of parts of the world are still not really industrialized, and this is a big reason why there's so much inequality today between the first world, Europe, Japan, and North America, and the third world, aka pretty much everybody else. One thing I want you guys to think about as we talk about the Industrial Revolution is that it represents a whole new phase of human existence. So the first kind of economic phase of humanity was the hunter-gatherer era. And this was by far the longest period, where for almost 500,000 years, human beings basically just lived off the land. All the work was performed by people. So if you wanted something done, you had to get some people together and do it. Everything around them was made by hand. Populations were very small and limited by natural environments. And it was really hard to acquire very much wealth, and it was hard to organize people in anything more than like a band or a small village. This changed with the agricultural era. And so the agricultural era is basically the one we've been in for the entire class so far. All labor is performed either by humans or by animals, because now we've domesticated animals. And so think, for example, of a horse, like plowing a field or pulling a cart. That's a big advance, because now you don't need a human in order to do this work. Still, everything is made by hand, though. Everything around you, if you lived before 1800, would have been made by somebody, which is pretty crazy to think about, because look around you now. How much of the stuff you see was actually made by a person? Compare that to how much stuff in the room was made by a machine. This might seem normal to you, but it's actually a really new phenomenon, being around things that are made by machines. So anyway, agriculture is important because basically what it does is people learn to alter the environment in which they live in order to support more people. So rather than living in the forest like hunter-gatherers would have done, instead agricultural peoples cut down the forest and plant corn, because you can get a lot more food out of an acre of corn than you can out of an acre of pine trees. And this leads to larger populations, more wealth, and more organization. The final economic era, and the one we're still in pretty much, is the industrial era. And this is the era where a lot of work is performed not by people but by machines. So machines for making stuff, machines for driving us places, machines for thinking, aka computers and smartphones. All of this stuff is replacing human labor. So one human being can do a lot more work. And so this allows us, one, to totally alter our environments, because now we have huge machines and special chemicals. And instead of just chopping down a forest, which would have taken a long time, we have huge machines that can plow fields and remove mountains and all sorts of crazy stuff. And basically this technological expansion leads to a huge growth in population, vast wealth, concentrated usually in the hands of a small percentage of wealthy people, and a highly organized society. So this is the industrial era, and we're still in it today. Let's take a moment and look at what Western Europe looked like before around 1750. And so this is before the Industrial Revolution starts. So in Europe, basically at this point, peasants, aka rural farmers, represent the vast majority of the population. 90% of the population in most countries were peasants. And the reason that so many people had to be peasants was that each peasant was barely able to produce enough to feed himself. And he was only able to pass on a small surplus of food to the people who weren't farmers. And this meant that you could only support a really small population of urban producers and religious and political elites. So all manufactured stuff was made by hand, and peasants made a lot of their own stuff. So like they spun their own cloth, and they made their own rope and their shoes and basic tools and stuff like that. But special goods would be produced by skilled craftsmen in the cities. So metal tools and furniture and pottery and luxury items would be made in the cities. But there wasn't very much of this stuff because the cities remained really small and all this stuff was made by hand. So it was hard to come by a lot of this stuff, and things were really expensive. And so, like I already mentioned, the cities remain really tiny. One of the biggest cities in Europe, Paris, had a population of 500,000, and it was seen as a huge, bustling metropolis. Consider today that Raleigh, a sort of medium-sized city, now has 500,000 people, if not more, if you could count the cities around Raleigh. But so the cities are growing a little bit, and this is because of world trade is leading to increased wealth in the cities. But they stay small because there's not a lot of extra food to go around. Now let's compare this to Europe in 1900, after most of Europe has kind of gone through the main part of the Industrial Revolution. Now there are huge cities in Europe, and they're all over the place. Cities go from representing like less than 10% of the population to representing about 1/3 of the total population in Europe. And the reason for this is mainly because of advances in farming that allowed farmers to support more people than before. And this has to do with certain technologies, but also new techniques that come about during the industrial era. So big cities represent big problems for these new places, like pollution and crime and sanitation issues. But it also leads to vast wealth because these cities are now producing tons and tons of valuable stuff that can be sold all over the world. now most things in the cities are made with machines. Machines are used in agriculture and in industry to kind of substitute for human labor. And this leads to huge increases of productivity, more stuff for everybody, and more wealth for the society as a whole. There's also mechanized transport. So before, if you wanted to go anywhere, you either had to walk or use a horse to take you there, or sail. But now, using mechanization, the power of steam, basically powered by coal, in trains and steamships allows for people to move faster than ever before. And so this vastly increases the speed of travel and leads to huge increases in trade. And basically all of this is possible because of a phenomenon known as self-sustaining growth. You can also think of it as a positive feedback loop of growth. And the reason that this happens is that basically every advance of the Industrial Revolution leads to more advances. So think just, for example, in terms of producing iron, which is one of the most important things that happens during the Industrial Revolution, is Europeans learn how to make lots and lots of iron using machines. And so increased production of iron makes iron really cheap and allows people to make better and cheaper tools out of iron. Now that you've got better and cheaper tools, this leads to more efficient iron mining, because now you can mine with cheap, well-made iron tools. This advance in mining technology makes it easier to get more iron and allows Europeans to make even more iron. And having cheaper iron allows the whole process to repeat. So basically, increases in production lead to more increases in production. And that's why that chart that we saw earlier basically starts to go vertical around 1800 and 1900. Last thing, and we're definitely going to talk about this more in future videos, but I just want you to see where all of this is going. And so let's think a little bit about how industrialization affects Europe's place in the world. So basically, industrialized nations, which we're just going to say Europe for short, but also includes the United States and Japan, have a huge advantage over non-industrialized nations because they have more people, more money, and more guns, and basically more everything that you need when it comes to taking over places. And so on top of this, industrialized nations need natural resources from other countries because basically they need these resources to feed their ever-growing factories. Basically, think of England as a tiny little island, and it's kind of run out of its own natural resources, so it needs to go get resources from other places. So England begins to set up a global empire. And what this means is that industrial Europe has both the power and the motive to set up a global empire. And basically from 1860 on until the end of World War II, Europe goes on to divide basically the rest of the world into a few huge empires. And so if you look here just at Africa, you'll see that Africa has basically, by 1900, been split up into basically just a few different countries' empires. So the light blue is France, the pink is Britain, the brown is Germany, yellow is Belgium. So even a tiny little European country like Belgium can take over a huge chunk of Africa. The only two independent nations left are the two little gray ones, one being Ethiopia and the other being Liberia, I think. And so basically Africa is divided up by hungry, industrialized nations. And one important thing that this leads to is it leads to lasting suffering and instability in the parts of the world that are colonized, and helps to explain the big divide between rich nations and poor nations in the world today. Thanks for hanging in there with me, and we will talk about all this stuff tomorrow.